Welcome everyone to the first ever webinar of the VALUMICS project. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So the topic of our webinar is sustainable food consumption behaviors. We want to understand the current challenges, the sustainability targets ahead of us, along with interventions and approaches that seem promising to help us getting closer to our future targets. My name is Mariana Nicolau and I'm project manager at the CSCP, a think and do tank on sustainable consumption and production, and we are one of the partners of the VALUMICS project. I'm speaking to you today from rainy Wuppertal in Germany, where the headquarters of the CSCP is based. And I can already see from the numbers here that we have over 60 participants already in our webinar, so it's a real pleasure to be with all of you here today. Thank you so much once again for joining us. So our webinar today is being recorded, and the reason for that is that we would like to share the link afterwards with the other participants that could not join us live. We would also advise you to make the best out of your time with us. So for that, if possible, try to reduce many things that you're doing in parallel. And we promise from our end that we are gonna try to make this as engaging and insightful for you as possible. We would love to hear from you. So please send your questions to the Q&A chat, to the Q&A window, and we are going to address some of those questions in a final speaker panel that we are going to host before closing today's webinar. And later on, key Q&A questions are also going to be answered and shared with everybody via email next week. In order to make our experience also a little bit warmer and more engaging, I'm happy to invite you to send your name and the name of your organization in the chat window, so not in the Q&A, but in the chat window, so you and the other participants can have a better feeling of who is in the room. Finally, if you experience any IT issues, any technical issues, please contact my colleague Ramon in the chat, and for that you can write all panelists and write directly to Ramon, and then he will be ready to support you. So let me start by giving you a little bit of introduction about the VALUMICS project before we really get into the topic. So VALUMICS is a Horizon 2020 European Commission funded project with about 21 partners, with 2 partners from Asia, led by the University of Iceland. And our main topic is food value chains, and our goal is to support decision makers in increasing the resilience, integrity, and sustainability of food value chains in Europe. And stakeholder engagement is one of the main components of our project, so enabling a dialogue for joint action among stakeholders in Europe is a main part of our mission. Here you can have an overview of our VALUMICS partners among universities, SMEs, research organizations, industry associations, and retailer. So why are we here today? The purpose of this webinar, and in our minds how we conceived it, is to have a conversation with you and an exchange about what works to support more sustainable food consumption behaviors in the European Union. For that, we prepared 4 main questions that helped us preparing for today and guided our preparation for being here now. First, how can we move towards a healthier and more sustainable food consumption, especially in view of the recently published EU Farm to Fork strategy? Then, which sustainable food consumption challenges and targets lie ahead of us in the future? Thirdly, thinking about interventions, how can food consumption behaviors and solution-oriented interventions trigger a shift towards a more sustainable future? And then finally, thinking about recommendations, we are asking ourselves, how are behavior interventions applied in real-life contexts, and what might we learn from them looking into the way ahead? So with these key objectives in mind, here's an overview of our agenda. As soon as I finish these welcoming words, I'm going to give the floor to Henk Westhoek from the European Commission, and he's going to talk to us about the EU Farm to Fork strategy. Following Henk's presentation, my colleague and partner in the VALUMICS project, Pierre-Marie Albert from IDDRI, is going to talk to us about 2050 targets for more sustainable food consumption, transition pathways, and diets to help us get in there. In the second part of our webinar, we're going to then, I am going to step in and contribute with the presentation piece by looking to behavioral drivers, challenges, and opportunities today to consuming food more sustainably. Following then by a presentation by my partner, Matthew Gorton from Newcastle University, who is going to then look into promising interventions for sustainable food consumption behaviors. The final presentation piece is done by my partner, Antonella Samoggia from the University of Bologna. And she's going to conduct an exchange with us about recommendations towards achieving food consumption impact reduction goals. As you can see, we're also going to bring in opportunities for interacting with you and hear your thoughts with polling questions, and also with your questions through the chat answered in the end with a Q&A panel with our speakers. So now I'm happy to introduce you to our first speaker of the day, and this is Henk Westhoek. Henk is Program Manager and Senior Researcher on Food and Agriculture at PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and he's currently seconded as a national expert at DG Sante in the European Commission. Henk is going to talk to us today about the EU farm-to-fork strategy, with a particular focus on promoting sustainable food consumption and facilitating the shift to healthy and sustainable diets. Welcome, Henk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. I just have to share my screen now. Is it visible? Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Henk.
Then I have to move back, I guess.
Give it another try. Super. Now it comes. Perfect.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And I'm honored to be able today to present to you the headlines of the farm-to-fork strategy, with a focus on the consumption part of the strategy. And of course, you have now all the opportunity, everything you want to ask about the strategy, which you were until now afraid to ask. So please go ahead. But the farm-to-fork strategy is part of the European Green Deal, which sets out how to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And it maps out a new and sustainable growth strategy to boost the economy, to improve people's health and quality of life. And of course, the farm-to-fork strategy is done directly towards the food system. Sorry, that was one too quick. Well, as you all know, the European food system faces many challenges. We have categorized them here in 3 categories with regard to social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability. And of course, on the social side, there are healthier diets and the big issue, how to reduce overweight, but also in the broader sense, how to reduce the non-communicable diseases, how to improve animal welfare, how to improve the social rights of workers in the food chain, and also how to increase food affordability, especially for the poorer people within Europe, but also outside Europe. And of course, the environmental sustainability is very important to tackle climate change, to protect the environment, to preserve biodiversity, and to enhance the circular bio-based economy. And finally, we should not forget that in the end, it has to also be economically viable. So there are also targets and objectives for fairer incomes for farmers and fishers and aquaculture producers, to have a just transition for everybody working in the food system, and to create new business and job opportunities. Well, the farm-to-fork strategy acknowledged that we cannot do this in a simple way. I mean, the food system is quite complex. There are many actors involved. We have many objectives. So we try to do so while respecting the complexity of the food system. So in the center, we have placed here the citizens and consumers, and around those, you can actually say there is the food environment as an interface between consumers and especially retailers and food manufacturers and the food service, but also the other actors in the direct actors in the food chain we have to address. But we're also aware that there are many actors around the primary actors, like researchers, advisory service, finance, knowledge providers, and even around that are the policy, the different authorities and their policies on the international level, European level, and at the local and national level. So we have to be aware that there are different levels of governance at play, and the Farm to Fork try to address all these different instruments. So including, there are instruments more based on legislation and regulation, there are instruments more based on financial incentives, on education, on research and innovation, on procurement, and on voluntary commitments. And of course, in all initiatives, we have to be aware of the mandate from the Commission, but also of the respective responsibilities of the national and local authorities and other actors. Well, the Farm to Fork contains the famous 4 targets, and in my humble opinion, they are a little bit overemphasized in the public communication, and there's a lot of discussion around these targets, but it has to be stressed that the Farm to Fork strategy contains many more objectives and targets than just these 4, but still I want to put them forward. These are the 50% reduction of the overall use and risk of pesticides, to reduce nutrient losses, to reduce the sales of antimicrobials in order to reduce antimicrobial resistance, and finally to achieve at least 25% of the EU under organic farming. But like I said, there are many other objectives, for example, regarding animal welfare, but also, of course, regarding a healthier and more sustainable diet. Well, then the big question is, how does the Commission want to achieve this? Well, there are many initiatives, many actions announced in the Farm to Fork strategy. And one of the major actions is to form a legislative framework for sustainable food system. And this framework will contain a comprehensive set of general principles and requirements on the sustainability of the food systems. And it tries to ensure policy coherence at the EU and national level, and to mainstream sustainability in all food-related policies. And it will contain provisions on governance and collective involvement of stakeholders. This may sound a little bit vague and high over still, and we are in the process of further developing this, but I think this legislative framework will be very important and crucial to arrive at healthy and sustainable diets, because, for example, it might contain certain regulations for certain prescriptions for actors in the food systems, for example, regarding marketing or regarding food composition, etc. So this is a very important initiative. Well, if we break down further than the Farm to Fork strategy, there are a number of actions to address sustainable food consumption, mainly through the Common Agriculture Policy. But I won't elaborate on this, but you can read this all in the Farm to Fork strategy. Then there are actions for sustainable fishing and aquaculture. The same as here, I won't elaborate on this. Then there are actions to stimulate sustainable practices by food industry and retail. And of course, these are very important also to enhance healthier and sustainable diets. And one of the important initiatives here is to improve the corporate governance framework and to integrate sustainability into corporate strategy. And also to develop an EU code and monitoring framework for responsible business and marketing conduct in the food supply chain. And also this code can be very important to change diets. The same is true for reformulation of processed foods, especially setting the maximum levels of certain nutrients, for example, for salt or fat or sugar. There are actions to set nutrient profiles to restrict the promotion of food high in salt, fat, and sugar. And there's legislation regarding food contact materials, marketing standards, and to tackle food fraud. But these are actions targeted to the food industry and retail, but there are also a number of actions targeted more directly to consumers. And hopefully the slide will pass on. Yes. And for this, if we want to make a shift towards healthy and sustainable diets, you could say there are the actions or changes needed in at least 4 areas, which is the food at offer, including reformulation, see the previous slide. The second one is changes in the food environment, which is very important. I think this notion of food environment resonated well within the Commission and is also central in the Farm to Fork strategy to improve information to consumers, especially through labeling. And a third action, not directly elaborated yet in the Farm to Fork strategy, but might be an outcome, is the pricing of food. And the idea is that healthier and sustainable food should become more affordable. Well, to do so, there are a number of actions announced, like highlighted here on the screen, for example, regarding VAT rates, which is currently already being discussed in the Council, and also a proposal for sustainable food labeling. Well, then there are a number of actions to enable the transition. I won't elaborate on this, but you can read it all later in the slides. And finally, I really have to stress, of course, that the transformation of the European food system cannot be done by the European Commission on its own, but it really requires a collective approach of farmers and fishermen, of food industry, retail, food service, of research and innovation, and also of citizens, NGOs. So the Farm to Fork strategy, you could say, is not the end of a process, but the beginning of a process, a discussion process, but also a process of interacting with all actors. So we really hope that this will finally result in a healthy and fair and sustainable food system in Europe. So in the end, it's down to us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henk. As I said before, it's a real pleasure to have you with us here today. Thanks for sharing your insights and also your view. So we have here a chance to hear from you an internal view from the Commission on the EU Farm to Fork strategy. Thanks a lot. I would really appreciate, as I said before, if you could stay with us, because towards the end, we're going to have a panel discussion with all speakers, so also with you to answer questions that our participants are going to send in the chat. Thanks a lot, Henk. So as I said also to everyone, please send your questions in the Q&A window to Henk, so questions to the first presentation you just heard and also to the ones to come. Well, coming next, I'm happy to introduce you to our second speaker of the day. This is my partner in the VALUMICS project, Pierre-Marie Albert. Pierre-Marie is the coordinator of the European Agriculture Initiative at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in France, IDDRI, and Pierre-Marie is going to look into the 2050 consumption targets towards sustainability, transition pathways, and diets. Pierre-Marie, happy to hand over to you.
Thank you, Mariana. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see my screen, but I guess that's the case. The idea is really to speak about 2050 consumption targets, so in the same vein than what Henk has just discussed. So the key question is, what sort of dietary changes or food consumption behavior changes do we need if we want to get to a sustainable European food system? There has been a growing consensus through scenario development over the last few years, saying in essence that we need to decrease the amount of animal protein consumption, increase the amount of fresh fruits and vegetables, and decrease the amount of fat and sugar in diets. So this is coming from different papers, Adrian Müller et al. From Nature, the paper from Mark Springman, our own work on agricultural Europe, and finally the Lancet Commission paper that was published in January 2019. But overall, in those papers where we have a growing consensus of what is the targeted diet, which I will describe in more details further, there is little discussion about how to get there, and not any discussion regarding what it would imply for food value chains or food value chain transformation in terms of their structure, the governance, and the socioeconomic impact it might have on jobs, GDP growth, etc., etc. So the aim of my presentation is really to bring you through a better understanding of what's the rationale for the sort of more sustainable diets in the European Union we are targeting in those scenarios, how far we are from those diets at the European level, taking into consideration that I will only use average values, which hide a lot of differences across Europe. And the idea is really to, with this webinar as a whole, to lay the ground for a broader scenario exercise that we are undertaking in this VALUMICS project whereby the aim is to design, to develop, to discuss with stakeholders transition pathways towards sustainable and fairer European Union food value chains, assuming that for those food value chains to be sustainable truly, we need to feed European citizens in a healthy and sustainable way as well. So starting point is diets today, and we will elaborate on today's insights for progressing on scenarios for fairer and sustainable value chains. So what do we talk about when we speak about sustainable food consumption patterns? There are at least three main dimensions: nutritional one, healthy and nutritive food for all; environmental, so we stay within planetary boundaries; and cultural, ensuring that what people will eat in the future will correspond broadly to what they already eat in a cultural sense, so from a food matrix perspective, and is adapted to the geographical context in the sense that it's not something that is not available at any point in the area we are discussing. So the idea is really, when we discuss about sustainable diets, to distinguish food items based on those three criteria at least, and to keep in mind that there is no good or bad food items per se, but it depends on the overall diet. So you cannot only consider food items from an individual perspective. You need to keep in mind the broader food matrix. So we keep a holistic perspective in that. And as I said, there is a broad consensus, but still some controversies on which I will elaborate in a minute. So starting with the nutritional dimension, which is probably I would say the most consensual, just remind you that there are questions regarding how much macronutrient people take, micronutrients as well, vitamins and minerals, and with those two aspects, we can identify dietary reference values for most nutrients, and then get to an analysis of aliment groups based on these values. So we can distinguish between better or worse food items. But again, the question is more about the food matrix as a whole. And this is not without heated debates in the discussion, but still broad consensus. I just give you the example here of, from a heart disease perspective, what are the sort of food you should eat and the sort of food you should probably avoid. So you have in fruits, nuts, fish, vegetables, etc. I don't list them all. And then the one you should avoid, grain, starches, etc., etc. So this is well known and relatively not too controversial. When we add the environmental dimension in that, what does it mean? How do we do that? The first thing is that the basis for considering the environmental impact of food is to put them into a framework. And our framework, the one we've chosen, is that of the planetary boundaries. So the planetary boundaries is a framework proposed by Johan Rockström and colleagues in 2009, which is now well established. And the idea is really to be able to characterize the impact on all those different aspects. And I'm focusing here on biodiversity, nutrients, flows, so biogeochemical flows, and land use change and freshwater. And you can see here in dotted areas on that circle correspond broadly to the contribution of the food system to crossing or not the different boundaries that are considered here. And you can see that the contribution of the food system to crossing certain of those boundaries is relatively high, or very high indeed. And in that, there is an undebatable impact of overconsumption and overproduction of animal proteins on nitrogen cycle, on GHG emission, on land use and freshwater use, which you can see also from that graph that basically consider how much greenhouse gases, land use, energy use, etc., are associated to the consumption of different types of product. I just would like to make a small warning here, which is the fact that all those data, all those analysis rests on LCA, life cycle analysis, average values. And we need to keep in mind that not all livestock systems have the same impacts. Some have only negative impacts, and some have also positive impacts. And in particular, grass-fed ruminant systems have a role to play when biodiversity and nitrogen management is accounted for. I don't want to elaborate here, but that's something we need to keep in mind at some point when considering dairy production, for example. There's still, to finish on that, an open debate regarding organic foods with respect to the fact that organic food requires more land because it's less productive, but there's also a consensus regarding the fact that organic food is truly sustainable when it is accompanied by thrifty diets, so not too rich diets. So overall, this brings us to this sort of table where you have what I can call the nutritional benchmark. So this is a proposal based on different reference values. And you have here the consumption in 2010 average values at the European level based on the EFSA database based on the 36,000 households data. And what you can see, I would like just to focus on 2 points. One is protein intake, and what you can see from that is that the protein intake is twice as much as what is needed from a nutritional point of view, and most of that, I mean, excess in protein comes from protein and animal proteins in particular, and red meat in particular, moreover. So there is a clear benefit from a health perspective as well as from an environmental perspective in reducing the animal protein intake, and in particular red meat intake. And there is also a clear health benefits in taking more of fruits and vegetables, which is basically under-consumed in the European Union from a health perspective. To finish my quick presentation, I just would like to add a third layer in thinking about diets, sustainable diets, which is the social and cultural dimension, which will, in a way, bring us to the way forward. How do we go from here to the targeted diets? We need to acknowledge and to recognize that there are strong heterogeneity between countries. I'm just here showing some data that dates back from the beginning of 2000, which clearly shows that the expenditures on meat are really different from northern to southern Europe. In southern Europe, basically, there is a more consumption of meat than in northern Europe. But also within countries, and this is clearly shown with that graph. So it's about obesity and overweight in France, for example. But we know that obesity and overweight is associated to the consumption of fat, sugar especially, and ultra-processed foods. And you can see that the wealthier you are, basically, the less likely you are to become overweight or obese, which clearly shows that there are big differences in how people eat in a country. So food consumption behaviors have been evolving in different social groups in different countries following different drivers. And if we want to truly develop dietary transition pathways, we need to better understand those drivers, how they play in food consumption behaviors, and how one can influence them. And I think this is exactly where Mariana would like to bring you through in the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Pierre-Marie. Thanks a lot for bringing some of the insights from our project to share with our participants today in our webinar. I think we heard now 2 pieces of presentation, and it's time that we'd like to hear from you. What are your initial thoughts in this regard? And for that, we're happy to put a polling for you on the screen, where you can choose some of options as your answers. So Ramon, I think we can launch the first polling now. And you may be able to see it already there. So the question is, what farm-to-fork strategy transitions towards more sustainable food consumption you consider most relevant for Europe? And those transitions are not the means, but the ends, the major goals that we extracted specifically for the sustainable food consumption part of the strategy. And you may be able to choose more than one answer. So there, as you can see, 1, moving to a more plant-based diet with less red and processed meat. 2, increasing consumption of whole grain cereals, fruits and vegetables, legumes and nuts. 3, reducing the environmental and carbon footprint of the food consumed, so then more looking into the performance or sustainability performance of food products. 4, preserving the affordability of food while generating fair economic returns. 5, reducing food waste. All of them, or you actually think of other transitions that you find most relevant? And in case of others, please share with us what you consider most important in the chat. Well, I already gave my vote, and we can wait a few seconds for you to vote as well. right. Ramon, if you could wrap it up, we could see then what is the tendency in the room or the opinion of our participants. So I hope you can also see that on your screens. So for the results, I received food waste or reducing food waste scores first with 47% of the answers as being the most relevant transition pathway, or let's say strategy transition for Europe at the moment, encompassed by the farm to fork strategy, followed then by moving to a more plant-based diet with less red and processed meat, which for me looks very interesting because those are very challenging transitions and changes in consumption of food, but so crucial at the heart of it. So I tend to agree with that. And then coming third, reducing the environmental and carbon footprint of food consumed, so the performance, addressing the performance, sustainability performance of food products. We could discuss more of those results when we come to our panel, if this is desired, and also hear what our speakers think of potentially transitions that are missing here, or in terms of the results in general from our speakers. So coming next, I'm happy to contribute to the presentation and talk about the behavioral drivers, challenges, and opportunities today with regards to food consumption behavior in Europe that comes from our work in the VALUMICS project. And to start with, I would like to bring us all to that one picture, to that moment of food shopping. That's, let's say, magical moment where a lot of the issues, implications, challenges that we are talking about today in our webinar are related to. And it might look simple, it might look something connected to our everyday lives that happens all the time, but it's something extremely complex because it's connected to various factors happening before that moment in time and across value chains, a lot of upstream things happening, and that's going to have a major impact in our own lifestyles and in society in general for now and for the future. So in spite of seeming very simple, it's something intricate, complex, and often or most often led by irrational behaviors and decisions, much more irrational than we like to think or assume. And of course, behaviors are something that we could even look here in more specific terms. So we are talking about consumption with this picture in general terms, but we could break it down into consumption in which places, by which consumers, of which products, for which purposes, to then try to understand behaviors in a further level of detail and understand how to adjust them. But in a bottom line, the main question we have been asking ourselves is how people behave today and why. And this is so because if behavior is what we want to change, especially then with regards to food consumption behaviors, is behavior what we need to understand, address, and measure. And that was our main starting point in the VALUMICS project, in the aspect of specifically understanding consumers and how they interact with food, understanding how people behave, what we call the landscape, and thinking about why they behave the way they behave. In other words, what lies behind behaviors, what we call the drivers or behavioral drivers. And in order to help us structuring our thoughts, in the very beginning, we reviewed various behavioral models. We put here some on the side, on the right-hand side, for you to see a few examples, the COM-B, FOX-B-MAT, and ISM, just to illustrate some of those that we reviewed. But we generally found them very useful to help us mapping in a model what are the informations about current food consumption patterns that we know, and also what are our knowledge gaps. And by also clustering and identifying those pieces of information across to certain categories to help us understanding then how to address those behaviors. And in a bottom line, despite of being different among themselves, existing current models, they tend to break down the factors behind the behavior along rather similar lines, starting first with the question of whether people want to do the behavior that you envision and target. And that's the question around the motivation. Are people motivated both with regards to their automatic thinking and reflective thinking to engage with the behavior that you want to put forward or that we, Europe, wants to put forward? Secondly, can people do it? In other words, are people capable and they have the opportunity to engage with the new food consumption behavior that is desired in the future? And then finally, the question of whether there is a reason for doing that now. And in this sense is the question of a trigger, something that helps and prompts the behavior to take place now and not in the future. So informed by those pieces, we did a review of existing evidence, we conducted focus groups, and we also had expert interviews in Europe. And we looked into food purchasing behaviors mostly in general, and in view of 5 selected product categories, which were beef, dairy, salmon, bread, and tomato. With regards then to the landscape, we asked ourselves how much is consumed over time, by whom, in which shopping contexts. And then finally, we had 5 key categories of behavioral drivers, as we called, meaning those reasons behind the actual behaviors, and we clustered them into 5 categories, being them personal factors, so aspects of personality, personal traits, cultural aspects, values, and so on, something internal to the individual. Secondly, social context, so the influence of aspects such as the work environment, family, friends, with regards to our food consumption behaviors. Thirdly, the aspect of environment and physical context, this meaning the place and the environment where food consumption happens, food purchasing happens. Fourth, the economic and marketing factors, and that encompasses price, incentives, subsidies, and so on. And then finally, the attributes of the products in terms of their quality attributes, health attributes, their packaging, and so on. So bringing here the aspect of beef consumption as one of the cases we looked into as an example. As I said, we looked first in terms of the landscape, so consumption quantities. How does it look like today in Europe with regards to beef consumption? So the average European has been eating both less beef and less meat in general, but this still means relatively high consumption levels of beef right now. So an average consumption of 11 kilograms per capita per year of beef, which is still about 2 to 4 times higher than recommended sustainable levels. And this is based on the Eat Lancet Commission report as a sustainability level basis. Looking then into the trend, it still looks also as a downward trend, meaning we can expect beef consumption to still reduce over time in the coming years in Europe per person, but is still a relatively timid reduction if we look into the targets that I just mentioned now for 2050. And when we ask ourselves, what are the characteristics of those consumers of beef in Europe? Well, it varies a lot across different consumer segments and countries. But a few ideas and insights here is first, men tend to consume more than women. And this in the various countries we looked into. Higher income is often associated to a higher consumption of beef. The connection of age, however, to the consumption of beef varies from country to country. So for example, in Germany, younger people tend to consume more beef than the elderly people, while in countries such as Italy, it's the other way around. And there is research also that shows that personality traits such as openness and friendliness is directly connected to, or let's say inversely connected to the consumption of beef, meaning the more open and friendlier people are, they identify the tendency of consuming less beef and meat. Of course, as an example of one case, but just to show a variety of socioeconomic and ethnographic aspects and criteria that have been investigated that shape the characteristics of consumer groups. And with regards to the place of consumption, it happens mostly in Europe in supermarkets sold readily cheap. And we saw that from our 5 categories of drivers, 3 seem to really stand out. So economic and marketing factors, personal factors, and food attributes scored relatively high or were reported a lot in existing research as shaping the consumption of beef and meat in Europe. First, because it's sold so cheap, it acts as a barrier to reducing meat consumption as price is to a primary consideration for many food shoppers. When we look into personal factors, the aspect of habits, food consumption, and especially meat consumption is highly habitual. And for that, then it becomes almost as something mechanic connected to our everyday life, through which no, let's say, deep, thoughtful thinking happens for a decision on whether to consume meat or not. And then in this sense, researchers also realized that willingness to pay or knowledge about health and environmental impacts connected to beef consumption have in the end a limited influence on the actual purchasing habits. Finally, with regards to food attributes, meat is still largely perceived as being something healthy. So knowing whether it is still possible to have a healthy lifestyle without consuming meat is a big discussion in different countries, which hinders our ability to foster more sustainable food consumptions here, in this case, more plant-based consumption to substitute meat consumption. And the aspect of convenience and usability of products is something, and especially then meat and beef products, for example, convenience cuts or ready to consume meals have fostered the consumption of beef in Europe. I would still like to bring to you a few insights from our focus group. So as I said, we talked to 40 consumers in 4 countries, so 160 consumers in total, in Italy, UK, Germany, and France. And this was then, here's an overview of people's perception. So their consumptions through their own eyes and shared in focus groups about their food choice. And then here, the key similarities that we realize across 4 all countries is that personal health is perceived as a key driver of consumption behavior across all countries. So mentioned by all participants, meaning that they perceive their food choices based on trying to achieve healthier diets. But also the aspect of family influence and price concerns were largely perceived as influencing their food choices. And what were the nuances and differences is that little knowledge and consideration about fairness, the aspect of fairness in food value chains, fairness to farmers, but also the broader aspect of sustainability. In the UK, in France, and in Italy seemed to be the case, so little knowledge and little or limited understanding, whereas in Germany we felt participants seemed to be quite knowledgeable and on top of those topics, but interestingly, this didn't seem to translate into coherent behaviors, meaning the fact of knowing or understanding well ecological considerations related to food consumption or fairness didn't mean that they were less impactful in their food consumption choices with regards to sustainability impacts. Bringing this idea also of what's the actual importance and role played by knowledge and by deliberate thinking and thoughtful thinking with regards to food consumption. But also the aspect of lack of trust in organic products, which is something, and organic labels that came up in the UK and Italy. Concerns around regionality and valuing regionality of products is something that came up quite strongly in Germany and in Italy. And also food packaging is something that concerned consumers a lot in Germany. So the key takeaways before a wrap up is the understanding that people are irrational most of the time, but it is somehow a predictable irrationality. So you know that a lot of irrationality is behind our food decision processes, but you also know ways to try to understand those challenges and identify what is the actual insight behind that and what really motivates people. Food consumption behaviors result from a combination of drivers. So it's a complex situation, but it's possible to identify what are the most influencing drivers. With regards to consumption of food in Europe, in general, we felt that price, social context, habits, and health were scoring highest in the priority and influencing factors of people's food consumption patterns and choices. That there was a general lack of knowledge about sustainability and fairness aspects, and those aspects were not top of people's list. Also a lack of trust about organic products and labels. This is something that came in the discussion of focus groups as mentioned. And then finally, this idea that knowledge, intention, and attitude is different from action. So in trying to address behaviors, we really need to be aware of that difference and then thereby fostering the actual action change, the actual behavior change, which might not be the same as changing the levels of knowledge or attitudes. What does this mean for us? That attitude, this multitude of drivers means that different actors need to act in the system. Here I'm thinking of policymakers, businesses, civil society organizations, researchers, and so on. to activate the desired drivers for consuming food more sustainably. The need to address also the very same drivers and barriers that shape choices today. By understanding what are the drivers, then we know where to focus our interventions, which comes exactly in the next point. Mapping food behaviors with a model help us to focus on exactly what needs to change, rather than jumping into how things might change right straight away. Providing information only might not do the job, as mentioned before, might not be a question of either or, but of complementing information and knowledge with other interventions. And then finally, the thinking that there is room for exploring consumer-related solutions to address the aspect of fairness, which seems to be limited or perceived in a limited way still by consumers, but it's so important right now for Europe. So with that in mind, I'm happy to hand it over now to my partner, Matthew Gotten. Matthew is professor in marketing at Newcastle University in the UK. He's also the coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project Strength to Food. Matthew is going to talk to us today about promising interventions for more sustainable food consumption behaviors. Matt, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome from sunny Newcastle. Can everyone see my screen? So
Not
what I'm
yet.
going to do...
No, we cannot see it.
You can, yeah, now it works, Matt.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. So building on Mariana's presentation, what I'm going to try and do now is look at the academic literature on what interventions have been successful in trying to change consumers' food choices. And here I think it's worthwhile starting that the farm to fork strategy envisaged several transitions to sustainable food systems. So some of the transitions occur at the level of the final consumer. So there are changes in the consumer diet, as talked about by Pierre Marie. But there are also changes envisaged which occur upstream of the final consumer in terms of how food is produced. So for example, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in food production. And this has an impact in terms of how we think about interventions within a farm to fork strategy. So we can have interventions which occur at the level of the final consumer. So we're trying to change consumer decisions. And the three main groups there are information-based approaches, economic incentives like taxes and subsidies, and then nudges linked to behavioral science, where interventions try and modify the choice environment, but without economic incentives or outright prohibition of particular options. Now, changes could also occur before the level of the final consumer. So these are upstream of the consumer, and this is known as choice editing. So it's eliminating certain options so that in some senses, consumer choices are curtailed. Now, consumer choice editing will be appropriate where consumers are happy to delegate decisions because they lack the time or the information or the knowledge to make decisions. So in the focus groups, which Mariana was talking about earlier as part of the VALUMICS project, consumers said that they were happy with choice editing where there are issues to do with, for example, enforcing standards, fair labour standards along food supply chains. But they saw that as an issue for government and the food industry. It wasn't something which they could directly control. But choice editing is limited where the problems occur after the consumer choice has been made. So, for example, if we look at food waste, the vast majority of food waste occurs not upstream of the consumer, but at the consumer level. And in that case, the choice editing approach may be more limited. So what I'm going to do now is concentrate on the literature regarding the information, economic incentives, and nudges. Now, there's been lots of studies here, and what I'm going to do is concentrate on field experiments. So these are not lab or simulation studies, but they typically involve real consumers in real situations with their actual behaviour using their own money. Now, we can't review all of those, so what I thought it would be useful to do is have a look at some meta-analyses for those 3 different areas. So what a meta-analysis does is tries to group together all of those studies within a particular domain and draw out the main lessons from them and look at the overall effects. So if we look at the information-based interventions, first of all, what we see that in only half of the cases, just over half of the cases, were the information-based interventions to try and lead to consumer dietary change actually successful in terms of meeting their primary objectives. And those which were more successful lasted over a longer period of time to achieve habitual change. And also they were more successful where they had a single objective, for example, reducing sugary drink consumption or eating more whole grains. Now this makes sustainable food transitions, as in the food farm to fork strategy, more difficult because there we're envisaging quite an array of different changes, not a single change in terms of just eating more whole grains, for example. The literature also says that who is delivering the message and who is delivering the information also matters. So the degree of rapport with the person leading the intervention, the degree to which they're trusted. But I think the main takeaway which we can say is that information-based campaigns alone tend to have limited success. So they either need to be combined with environmental change interventions, or they can be an important precursor to the success of other interventions. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now let's have a look at the literature on economic incentives. So here there are a number of studies which have looked at the effects of taxes on products which governments and policymakers would like to see consumption reduced. So for example, on fast food or sugary soft drinks. And there has also been studies which have looked at subsidies on products which would like to promote consumption of, so for example, fruit and vegetables. And what we see is that both taxes and subsidies can be effective. So overall, pulling across all the studies, 10% decrease in the price of healthy fruit and vegetables leads to a 12% increase in consumption. So there's an elastic effect there. And if we look at taxes, 10% increase in the price leads to a decrease of 6%. So that's inelastic in nature. Now, when we look at the subsidies for fruit and vegetables, those interventions are often combined with information-based campaigns and communication-based campaigns. So trying to delineate the specific effect of the subsidy on its own can sometimes be quite difficult. But one of the good things about economic incentives, if we look across all the studies, is that they seem to work in different countries, in different locations, different settings, in canteens and retail, with a consistent level of effects. Now, one problem with the literature, however, is that most of the studies don't look at cross-price effects. So, for example, it may be that the tax on sugary soft drinks decreases the consumption of that specific product, but it may be that consumers consume sugar in other ways instead. And there's also a lack of those studies looking at some of the spillover effects or desirable spillover effects, for example, on obesity and other health measures. Now let's look at some of the nudge-based interventions from behavioural science. So here I'm again looking at a meta-analysis which groups those interventions into cognitive-based interventions, so they're having an effect on what consumers knows, then affective in terms of what they feel, and behavioural in terms of what they do. Now you could argue that in terms of how these are classified, and all of them are trying to have behavioural outcomes, but I'm just using the descriptors here as a way of trying to convey what's in the literature and what seems to be most effective and what's least effective. So if we look at the cognitive, we have descriptive nutritional labeling. So this is things like providing factual information through on-pack description of calories. Then we have more proactive labeling techniques, so evaluative nutritional labeling, such as traffic light systems. And then we also have visibility enhancements. So we're trying to make healthy options more visible. So for example, in terms of where they're placed within store and on shelves to stimulate choice. Then we have the effective interventions. So this is in terms of how healthy foods are described. So trying to improve their hedonic appeal. So describing a soup on a cold winter's day as warming and fulfilling. And there may also be direct healthy eating calls through direct encouragement. So saying, make the healthy choice in store or within a canteen. And then behavioural enhancements or behavioural interventions. Here we see attempts to make healthy food more convenient. So for example, pre-sliced fruit and vegetables, and also size enhancements. So that may be changing portion sizes for healthy and unhealthy foods to increase or decrease their consumption respectively. Now what that literature says is that the cognitive-based interventions, overall, the effects of those on consumer behaviour is the least, and then at the other end of the extreme, the behaviourally oriented interventions have the greatest effect, with the effective interventions somewhere in between. Now, the effects of the nudges, looking at all the different studies overall, are equivalent to about a 10% permanent price reduction. So they have a significant, but in many cases quite small effect. Now, if we look at some of the most successful nudge-based interventions, one of the lessons from that is to try and make desired behaviour as easy as possible to perform. So it's the convenience. And we can see there the lessons of recycling. So if we think about household recycling, that could be either done by consumers taking their waste, paper, glass and other products to a recycling centre, or we may have curbside recycling where all households have to do is put their waste outside their door. And what we find is that when recycling moves from a recycling centre to curbside recycling, recycling goes up by double, in some cases triple the rate. Now, nothing has changed in terms of attitudes or in terms of the information available to consumers or their emotions. We're just making the desired behaviour much easier and simpler to perform. And there's lessons also there for food choice and behaviour. Now, a couple of caveats regarding the nudge-based interventions. So first of all, these studies typically produce and report the effect on the overall sample. What they do not do is look at particular subsamples. And there may be a danger that nudges, in effect, preach to the converted. So they may nudge people who already have a reasonably healthy diet towards an even greater, healthier diet, rather than having an influence on those people who have a very poor diet. And this links to one of the key lessons from the nudging literature, is that nudges only work when people are predisposed to the direction of travel. So people will only be influenced by nudges towards healthier diets and more sustainable food consumption if they believe that is a worthwhile goal which they would seek to achieve. So that brings us back to some of our information-based lessons, that it's important that people understand the benefits of sustainable diets and consumption for these nudges to be effective. Now, finally, just looking ahead to what work we're doing currently with VALUMICS, looking at in-store interventions to try and improve consumer food choices. Here we're working with the international retailer Reve, and Gunnar Mott says that retailers can do three main things to influence consumer diets. So they can act as choice providers by providing more sustainable products or healthier products in store. They can act as choice architects, so the way in which the store is designed will influence consumer behaviour. And they can also edit the choices of consumers, for example, by limiting or removing unsustainable items. And what we're currently doing is investigating an example of each of those three types of intervention, looking at their effectiveness and their strengths and weaknesses. And we hope to report back on that in a future webinar. So thanks very much. And I'll now hand you back to Mariana.
Thank you so much, Matt. Now I would like to invite you to jump into our last piece of presentation today with my partner, Antonella Samudia. Antonella is professor at the Department of Agricultural, Food and Sciences at the University of Bologna in Italy. And she's gonna conduct a conversation with us all about the recommendations we are currently discussing as part of our consumer analysis group in the project towards achieving food consumption impact reduction goals. Antonella, over to you. I see your screen. You could unmute yourself and come in with your video as well.
Okay.
Welcome, Antonella.
Hi, welcome to everybody. I will share the screen now. Sorry. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen, but it's still not yet.
Okay.
Yes, coming up. Perfect.
So welcome to everybody. I've been following also the chat that was in the Q&A, and it was very interesting to see it's a very lively discussion. So what I will present today, it's a work in progress that we are developing within the VALUMICS project. And in particular, we are developing, identifying and clustering a number of stakeholder recommendations, and we are clustering them into categories in order to better convey a message that could be a more systematic way of approaching the issue. So we are grouping our categories, our recommendations into four main areas. One is the choice editing. So as I was mentioning earlier during the other presentations, we are aiming to identify insights and suggestions and recommendations to decrease the number of products. So that's the area, the aim is to diminish, contain basically the choice of consumers for low environmental, nutritional, social, economic sustainability. This may be particularly effective when consumers lack knowledge, opportunity, or social support to make sustainability-oriented decisions. And they would like, as during the focus groups was pointed out, they would like to delegate somehow the responsibility for sustainable choices to somebody else along the agricultural chain. Providing consumers with a choice of more sustainable products, that's the other area where we're grouping our recommendations, so the choice expansion. So making sure that consumers can effectively make decisions and choose products that are sustainable because they are available, they are accessible, they are, let's say, at the disposal of the consumer. Then we have another area, which is the choice environment. Basically, this grouping means having recommendations that intervene, let's say, in the in-store environment, how the products are presented, and I will show some examples in this area as well. So basically, we are aiming to ease the access of consumers to these sustainable products. There are other areas. The last grouping is having, let's say, actions which go beyond the specific purchasing situation of the consumer, and they might be more relevant in a more broader area. To give you an example, I was glad, to be honest, also that during the chat I saw that many comments were related to the organic, which is not necessarily an area of a main area for the project, but it was raised during the focus groups clearly, because that's one of the areas where consumers mainly would like to invest, or tend to associate to what is a sustainable food product. So two main data. The dimension of the market, which I think it's a relevant information because it gives an idea of where the market is going. At the moment, latest data, available data, say that the German market is the biggest market. Clearly, it's also due to the number of inhabitants of the country. Then we have France and Italy, Switzerland, UK, etc. And then if we look at the other graph, what we have is that the countries with the highest organic share and how it changed through the years, we see that in some countries the overall share diminished between 2018 and 2017 and 18, whereas in other countries such as in Italy, the Netherlands, it's pretty much stable, so did not change much. But then again, the market share, it is a relevant information. So what drives the consumers into organic food, and what kind of information, what kind of attributes consumers associate to organic food? Well, for the consumer, organic food has a unique value. It is probably not so much comparable to other categories, but it's not so far, or anyway, it is what the consumer embodies into a sustainable food product. Well, they think that organic food tastes good. This is I have to say, an achievement, because consumers have always thought that organic food was not as good. And this applies also to other, I would say, healthy food, and possibly also to some sustainable food. It is considered healthier. This is a main driver for organic food consumption. Consumers believe that this is an investment for their future health. They trust or they believe that it has a positive environmental impact. It is good in terms of animal welfare. This is also strengthened by the next regulation for organic agriculture, approved by the Commission. And then we have an area which I think it's important to keep in mind. There is a strong overlap in consumers' mind in between organic, short chain, non-GMOs, local food. So for them, it is very much, these areas, these food attributes are very much related. What are the barriers? Well, the barriers, there are a number of barriers, and I think could be, again, insightful for elements for more healthy and sustainable food that we see today, is the lack of confidence. Consumers do not fully trust the regulatory system, but also the certification process. This is more relevant in some countries than others, but it is an element to be kept in mind. There's a distrust to organic production as such. Some people are concerned about the food safety of organic good. They believe there might be elements of contamination. So this is another, let's say, worrying area. The habit of not buying organic products, also Mariana was mentioning earlier, there is an issue of, let's say, perpetuate the same behavior that you already have. And some consumers are not used to buying organic products. Lack of availability, somehow it might be real, might be perceived, but consumers do believe they cannot access organic food. Lack of knowledge, information, involvement, interest in environmental sustainability, and this is another area. I would like to have a focus on price. This was mentioned during the Q&A chat, price in general and for organic. So just briefly, it is true that organic food is more expensive. Latest data, this is national, Italian national level, would say that organic food, it's about in between 50 and 70% more expensive than conventional products. The European Union in a publication even say they might be up to 150% higher than other products, same clearly in the same category. And latest data show that private label organic products are cheaper. And this is a very key element in terms of expansion of sustainable food. Price factor, it is considered a barrier. We saw it throughout the presentations, but then again, there's no one that really says that having cheap organic would increase the sales. So overall, what we gather also from the interviews with stakeholders, we did interview national organizations for organic food, and somehow there is a new positioning from these associations, so the organic food associations, processors mainly, clearly. Well, there's been a strong focus so far about the environment and health positioning. Now organic food is becoming positioned as a fairer product, fairer in the sense that they would pay a higher price to their farmers upstream in the chain. So they are changing their positioning. Why they're doing this? It is also partly due to the fact that the retailers are coming in. They have entered into the organic market strongly. They offer cheaper prices. And by now, specialized organic chains are suffering a lot because clearly the consumer can find organic food anywhere in many other channels. So going back to the choice editing, this was an example and it may be easily applicable to these examples. So the idea is to eliminate certain types of products that do not meet a minimum sustainability threshold. As mentioned, it might be the fair price paid to the farmers, sustainable packaging. Very important across the literature, also from research, recent research, is the adoption of a cross-sectoral approach where policymakers from different backgrounds come together and define a joint action in that sense. And the farm to fork strategy, clearly it's one of those. It's also important to establish a dialogue with powerful chain actors. So as Matthew was mentioning earlier, that's what we are trying to do, to establish a dialogue with large retailers and big processors on promoting sustainable initiatives, so products that might be sustainability oriented. So there is a need for an intra-chain cooperation. And also to strengthen the role of independent third-party accredited labeling. Not the labeling is the same, and there is a need to homogenize the different systems. So clearly, what's in it, policymakers, businesses should get together, discuss, and find what could be a commonly agreed minimum standard for sustainable, healthier, and sustainable products. Choice expansion, the idea is to provide a wider choice of sustainable products. How to do it? One way could be to do it through public green procurement. There are a number of outlets, retailers that could contribute to that. School canteens, prisons, hospitals, all public green procurement. Support certification schemes and eco-labels, so getting private standards to consumers. I would like to underline this aspect. When there has been the BSE crisis and this food safety became top of the agenda for all the agri-food actors, the retailers did play a key role in this. And they started introducing also their own private standards in that sense. So they can play a key role in this aspect. Offering seasonal production and regional local production. Again, for the consumer, there is a strong overlap in these areas, but this definitely can be an area where consumer is rather sensitive. So again, for policymakers, we can have incentive for the business sustainability-oriented innovation. So focus on innovation that is sustainability-oriented, and for the business to the opportunity to offer more sustainable options, and possibly also position themselves in the market for that. So it is important to have a sustainability focus in the business and in the product offered. Choice environment. This area is this group of insights, the recommendations that we are developing is to somehow integrate rather than segregate more sustainable options along with more conventional food options. So not necessarily create exclusive or only specialized healthy and sustainable food, but really to put it next to any other option. For example, vending machines could be another area. And vending machines at the moment are usually pretty rich of unhealthy food, or what is considered unhealthy food. Well, having more healthy and sustainable food choices in vending machines can be an area of expansion. Reduce portion and plate sizes could be an area, as also mentioned earlier. Having science-based information and communication. There's a lot of information at the moment, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of noise, let's say, around the consumer. Let's say probably it's more effective to focus on few messages, as Matthew was pointing out, one straight message, keep it for some time, as long as it is science-based, and that will make it more successful. Reduce the visibility of unhealthy food. Again, unhealthy food is very visible, and acting in that area can contribute. We may have positive feedbacks from insights for policymakers and businesses. Controlled environment can be fruitful spaces for policymakings, as we were saying, but also shaping the physical environment within the outlets where consumers buy. Could be retailers, could be restaurants, would definitely foster the public acceptance and curiosity towards more sustainable products. And the last one is beyond choice. That means some actions could be done also beyond the purchasing moment. As such, fostering work-life balance can help. This can contribute to engaging to more healthier food consumption habits. Having a multidimensional sustainability in schools. This was another point that was pointed out in the chat, in the Q&A. This is an area of expansion. It was mentioned by some stakeholders and also from the literature. So it is an area, a key area of expansion of investment. So for policymakers, clearly this would mean incentivizing flexible work schedules, routines, family commitments, etc. But also the possibility of new ways of work, where we have seen this through this time of pandemic, and it could be an area of further expansion to go in the direction of healthier and more sustainable consumption.
Thank you so much, Antonella. Thank you so much. I would then invite now all our speakers to come up on the screen with their video and audio, because we have received so many questions. So now it's the exciting time for us to be able to have a conversation about some of those questions and hear from at least one of you for one question. And then for that, my colleague Luis Esquivel, directly from Costa Rica, is helping us capturing those key questions from our Q&A and posing them to our speakers. So please come everybody with video and audio, and let's have this conversation. Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and thank you all for all these participants for the great questions. We have received a lot of questions, so we are going to filter, let's say, the main ones that we have here, and I will ask each one of the panelists that you have 2 minutes to answer. So I will start with Henk. The question for Henk that I filter here is, what has changed in the European Commission in relation to the new European farm-to-fork strategy? If there has been any change in previous ideals or objectives of the European Commission, how has this changed now with this new strategy?
Well, I think there has been a major change within the Commission in terms of that the farm-to-fork strategy is really an integrative food policy document, whereas previously the Commission had more separate tracks, one for agriculture, one for food security, one for animal welfare, etc. And now this is really an integrated approach. I mean, the approach many scientific advisors have been asking for to come up with a more integrated food system approach. And I think the farm-to-fork really tries to deliver it. Of course, it's still difficult to do so, but I think it's a good, very good start, the farm-to-fork strategy in delivering this integrated approach. And you can also see it on the ground within the Commission. That's much more cooperation between the different DGs, between DG Agri, excuse me, DG Environment, DG Mare, etc. They're all very involved in this strategy.
Thank you very much, Henk. Indeed, this is a big change and very ambitious change for the future.
Yeah. I think it's also very good. I mean, the primary target, of course, of the Green Deal is to deliver on climate, to reduce climate change and to have lower greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's very good. It has been put in a wider context of health and biodiversity, and but also a fairer system, addressing also the health aspect of the food system. So I think it's very good that it's not a very skewed and very narrow policy just targeting greenhouse gases, but it is put in a wider framework. And I think in the end, it's even also better for greenhouse gases. I think in the end, you will achieve more than having an isolated policy.
Thank you very much, Henk. Now we go to Matthew Gorton. We have a very interesting question here. The question is, retailers collect much valuable data on consumer behavior. How can we encourage them to share it openly, aside from providing new insights that this could also contribute to novel downstream services? This is for you, Matthew.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think probably one of the answers to that is projects like VALUMICS, where you have a multi-actor project where you bring together academics, other stakeholders, and retailers are included within the consortium. So REVE is a part of the consortium. And I think that brings them within food research and innovation activities in a way in which such actors weren't involved in the past. And that provides a mechanism in which it's possible to learn from them and their experiences and what internal data they're willing to share, and also have a dialogue with academics and hopefully then present the outcomes of that joint work within the public domain. So I think a lot of it is thinking about mechanisms by which we can bring together academic and non-academic stakeholders within the food supply chains to unlock that data and that insights which is present.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Very interesting. We're moving on here to some other interesting questions. This is for Pierre-Marie. This is a very broad question and very, I would say, general one, but also important. Which country do you think is currently at the forefront of the sustainability and food consumption behaviors in Europe, and why? Pierre-Marie.
Oh, very, very tough question. I think from the focus group that we had, it was quite clear that the German people were quite sensitive to sustainability issues. So I wouldn't say that Germany or German consumers are more aware than others, but it's also something that we also see clearly when we look at for example, the dairy sector. You see clearly that the demand for organic milk and for GMO-free milk is raising very, very quickly in Germany, while it's not the case really in France. So I cannot say for the EU27, I don't have a complete view on all countries, but I really do believe that German consumers are pushing quite strongly for more sustainable foods. But then there's also a question of the relationship between farmers, processors, retailers, and consumers. So it's not only about consumers demanding for this or for that, it's also about what sort of relationship does exist between all those players within the food system. And I would say that in France, we are experiencing a sort of a stronger and stronger divide between society and farmer, and a bigger and bigger distrust. And we need to fix that if we want to move forward in terms of consumer demanding more sustainable food, because they will need to trust the level of sustainability of that food provided by farmers, processors, etc.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Marie. Indeed, a very complex question, but we can see also that there are certain countries that are having some interesting drivers and actions towards sustainability. The other question is more punctual. This is for Antonella. The question is, why do you think people distrust organic labeling? Antonella.
There have been quite a number of research on trust and along the chain. Overall, it is there is somehow an overlap of understanding of on labeling in general. So even accessing a full understanding of the labeling, it's usually not so straightforward. Again, people would rather trust something that is next to them. So it would be something that is local, something that is regional food, some brand, private labels as well. So they would delegate. They need to associate the brand itself together, so the organic logo together with another dimensions of connection. So that's a key way of delivering this kind of message. There are different levels of trust and distrust. Usually, yes, there is a level of connections. There's a mix of elements which we should target in order to increase that level of distrust.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Indeed, also super interesting. And we have here another question. This is for Mariana. The question is, do you find that skills and confidence in cooking can be a barrier to sustainable food behavior? This is, for example, the obsession with meat for proteins, for example, rather than other types of foods that could be, for example, more healthy or less impactful to the environment. Mariana.
That's a very interesting question. Thanks, Luis. I think when I think about the focus groups we conducted, and also thinking about the comparison we did across countries, I guess it became clear that, well, the specific aspect of cooking didn't come up so strongly, but what became clear is that social interaction plays such a strong role in our food consumption habits, that being in a, let's say, inviting or supporting environment helps then overcoming things such as even knowing different food types or cooking or so. So people reported, for example, that when they left their parents' house and moved in with their girlfriend, or they left their parents' house and went to university and lived in an apartment with other friends, that they then changed completely their food consumption behaviors, for example, became vegetarians or vegans. And then in that context, so it felt like the social aspect and context where they were was a deciding aspect for them to change their food consumption behaviors. And then by being there, it was fine to just, or to engage with new food habits and cook together. And that was the key, let's say, driver to then enable other aspects such as cooking. And we did a recent test, we were part of a recent test with regards to a vegan app here at the CSCP recently. And the aspect of being part of a WhatsApp group was the key motivation and aspect for people to then look for recipes and then look for cooking skills to eat more plant-based in their diets. So what I found interesting is this connection to the social context to then feel enabled and empowered to cook and shop accordingly.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And I think we are now on time. And I just want to pose this question for all of you to think a little bit about this. This question is for you to take home, and this is, what is the one insight you would consider the most important for advancing to a more sustainable food consumption, not only in Europe, but for the whole planet? So this is, I think, a key message that we want to pose. Mariana, you.
Super. Thanks, Luis. Something for us to reflect and take with us. I come back just for a couple of final slides to remind everybody that you're going to receive a follow-up email from us with the recording link of today's webinar, with the slides of today's webinar, key Q&A also answered. So I'm aware we received many more questions than we were able to answer now, but we are going to get back to you next week with a selection of those questions answered by the team. And there will be also a follow-up survey. So in this email, we provide you with a link and invite you to take up the survey. And the survey is mainly to hear from you your impressions about the different clusters and groups of recommendations that Antonella presented to you earlier today, and get your views on those recommendations in terms of what you think makes sense, what you think is missing, thereby helping us shaping the content of those recommendations in the report that we're going to put out in this regard end of September. And it's interesting to talk about the report because also the previous pieces are going to be published step by step in various reports available to all of you. So we also follow up with you on that. And talking about a final message and take home message that Luis said, this is one sentence that touched us a lot and we thought we could bring for you as a final message, thinking that food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. So giving us the chance to see food consumption behaviors as an opportunity for living healthier and more sustainably in the future. So jointly taking that message together and working further and make that possible. Having said that, I'd like to thank a lot our speakers for being here with us today, and thanking you all for taking part, sending your questions. Let's continue that conversation further via email exchange and the follow-up survey we mentioned. Have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.